A billionaire, unable to bring back the smile of his paralyzed daughter, finds a homeless boy dancing in the street. He invites him to his mansion and, through prejudice, hidden truths, and an unexpected pact, a bond is born that changes lives, awakens silent miracles, and touches the entire world. The sun began to light up the city with its first golden rays, and from the top of the tallest tower, a man watched in silence. His name was Alejandro Santori, a name that in the business world meant absolute power. In his hands, he held an empire that stretched from luxury hotels in several capitals to technology and automobile companies. His life was a parade of meetings with politicians, banquets in shining halls, and applause from investors who worshipped him like a modern titan. Yet, as he looked at the horizon through the window of his private suite, he felt an emptiness that no million-dollar contract or number on a screen could ever fill. In the heart of his mansion lived a silence stronger than any victory. His daughter, Valeria, only 9 years old, remained in a wheelchair after an accident had erased the smile that once lit up everything. Alejandro remembered that day over and over. The sudden fall, the ambulance, the hospital full of cold lights, and the cruel diagnoses that spoke of permanent damage. Since then, the girl seemed to have faded away. She did not cry, she did not laugh. She simply existed. And he, a man who could buy entire islands, felt powerless in front of the only investment he truly wished for, bringing back his daughter's joy. Every morning, Alejandro hid himself in the routine of an unstoppable businessman. He ate breakfast at endless tables decorated with silver and crystal, but always alone. He reviewed reports, signed deals, ordered acquisitions. His employees looked at him with admiration and fear, as if he were a king no one should contradict. But behind that mask of steel, he carried a desperation that consumed him. The house, no matter how luxurious, felt like a prison of memories. Silent halls, cold statues, clocks marking a time that no longer moved the same since Valeria's laughter was gone. At times, he invited the best doctors in the world. Specialists came from Switzerland, Germany, or Japan, bringing promises of innovative treatments. But all ended with the same words: "There is nothing we can do." The millions he poured into science crashed against an invisible wall. Alejandro left those meetings with a hard face, pretending to be strong, but inside he felt that each no was a blow that left him more and more alone. The city admired him as a symbol of success. Magazines called him the golden magnate. But deep down, Alejandro knew his life was painted in gray. At night, he sat next to Valeria's bed, held her hand, and tried to tell her stories. The girl stared at him with her big, still eyes, and he searched for a spark that would confirm hope still remained. But that spark appeared only rarely. It was as if she was trapped behind an invisible wall he did not know how to break. One morning, different from the others, found him standing on the main balcony. The city woke with its usual chaos. Horns, engines, street sellers shouting, music rising from the avenues. Alejandro watched with a bitter expression. For many, that noise was just annoying. But for him, it was a reminder of something he had forgotten. Life outside was still moving, vibrant and real, while he remained locked in his empty empire. The billionaire sighed. Behind him, the butler announced the car was ready to take him to his next meeting. Alejandro grabbed his leather briefcase, adjusted his tie, and prepared to step into his private elevator. But before leaving, he gave one last look at the portrait hanging in the main hall. A huge painting of Valeria smiling with her little teeth, wearing a pink dress full of flowers. That image hurt him the most, and at the same time, it was what kept him standing. He promised himself that, even if science said impossible, he would find a way to bring that smile back. It did not matter how much it cost. It did not matter how many years it took. Because in the end, what good was an empire if it could not draw a laugh from the heart of the person he loved most? That thought stayed with him as he walked through the glass doors and stepped into the waiting limousine. The city was already alive with movement. Alejandro did not know that, in the middle of that noise, destiny had prepared a scene for him. A scene that was not in any of his schedules or contracts. A scene that would change not only his life, but also his daughter's, and the life of a boy he had not yet met. The limousine moved slowly through the morning traffic. Inside, Alejandro reviewed on his tablet the reports his assistant had sent him since dawn. Numbers, projections, and graphs seemed to speak of a secure future. Yet none of it could shake off the shadow that followed him since leaving the mansion. The memory of Valeria's portrait, with that lost smile, kept him tangled in a heavy silence. The driver, used to navigating crowded avenues, braked suddenly at a red light. The vehicle stopped at the corner of one of the busiest areas of the city. Alejandro lifted his eyes only out of habit, without real interest in what was happening outside. He was used to looking through the tinted windows, as if they were a wall protecting him from the world's noise. But that morning, something different caught his attention. In the middle of the crosswalk, among street vendors and hurried passers-by, a boy spun to the rhythm of faint music coming from an old speaker. He wore worn-out clothes, pants with torn knees and a t-shirt stained by time. His feet, barely covered by tired sneakers, tapped the asphalt with precise rhythm. The boy danced, not with the clumsiness of someone improvising, but with the devotion of someone who carried dance in his bones. Without realizing, Alejandro leaned forward. The music was just a thin metallic sound, but the dignity with which that child moved his arms and spun among horns and shouts was hypnotic. It was not performance, it was survival. He danced as if every movement was a matter of life, as if the asphalt was both stage and shelter. A small crowd stopped to watch. Some smiled, others tossed coins into a cardboard box at the side. The boy, however, did not beg with his eyes. He did not ask for pity. His face showed focus, effort, and something deeper. A dignity that could not be broken, not even by the misery around him. Alejandro felt a strange knot in his throat. In his world of luxury, art had always been tied to expensive theaters, prestigious academies, and shows reserved for the few. Seeing it there, raw, stripped of ornaments, turned into a lifeline for a boy who had lost everything, disarmed him in a way he never expected. The driver cleared his throat, uncomfortable, as if the scene meant nothing. "Sir, once the light changes we can move," he said in a neutral tone. But Alejandro did not answer. For the first time in a long while, he stopped looking at his tablet, stopped thinking about meetings, and simply watched. As the boy finished a spin, he lifted his head, and for an instant, his eyes met the tycoons behind the dark glass. It was just a fraction of a second, but Alejandro felt pierced by that gaze. There was hunger in it, yes, but also fire. A fire that reminded him of something he had lost in himself. The ability to fight without calculating every risk, to give himself fully without the promise of success. The light turned green, and the cars behind began to honk, impatient. The nervous driver accelerated. The limousine moved forward, leaving the boy behind, shrinking into a small dot in the rear-view mirror. Still, Alejandro did not look away until the corner had disappeared completely. For the rest of the ride, the reports in his hands felt like empty paper. His mind could not let go of that image. A boy dancing in the street as if every step was a defense against life itself. That dignity, so different from the kind he knew in golden halls, had struck him with unexpected force. He crossed his arms and took a deep breath. Something inside him was stirring, as if fate had knocked on his window at an ordinary traffic light. He did not know it yet, but that brief instant, caught between red and green, would be the beginning of a story that would shake every certainty he had. Traffic kept moving, but in Alejandro's mind the lights still felt red. The boy was already behind him, yet his eyes remained. They were sunken, marked by lack of rest and the harshness of the street, but with an intensity Alejandro could not ignore. They were not begging eyes. They shouted resistance, as if refusing to surrender to the life they had been given. The businessman was used to looking at people through barriers. Office windows, dark car glass, screens filled with statistics. Those walls kept him safe, protected from any contact with a reality he considered foreign. But the boy's gaze, brief as it was, had pierced that wall like lightning, forcing him to remember that beyond his walls of luxury, there was a world he could not buy. He leaned back against the leather seat. He tried to return to the numbers, to distract himself with the presentations waiting for him. Nothing worked. In his memory, the broken sound of the boy's speaker kept echoing. An improvised melody, rough, almost off-key, but alive. Alejandro thought about the irony. He had hired the best musicians to play at his private parties, funded orchestras, bought collections of old records, and yet, that tired street music had left a mark deeper than any of the others. The car turned onto a wide avenue, and the buildings began to look more elegant. The city changed its skin, as if trying to hide poverty behind shiny facades. Alejandro looked outside again. He saw men in suits walking fast, women carrying bags from exclusive stores, young people laughing together. Everything seemed in order, in its place. And still, inside him, the image of the boy clashed like a note no one could silence. The driver, curious about his boss's unease, dared to ask, "Are you all right, sir?" Alejandro blinked, surprised at the boldness. It was unusual for anyone to break the silence during these rides. "Yes," he answered dryly. "I'm just thinking." He could not admit that what distracted him was not a pending deal or a risky investment, but a boy dancing in the middle of the street. What would his partners say if they knew? What would the newspapers think? The ones that always painted him as a cold, calculating man, incapable of being distracted by small things. At the next light, the car stopped again. Alejandro looked outside once more, almost hoping to find those eyes again. Though he knew it was impossible, the boy would be far away by now, lost among corners, repeating his routine in front of other cars, collecting coins barely enough to eat. And yet, in that moment, Alejandro felt that the gaze had stayed with him. It was like a mirror forcing him to question himself. When was the last time he had that kind of fire in his own eyes? When had he stopped living just to maintain his empire? The sound of his phone broke the thought. It was a call from his closest partner, insisting on the importance of the meeting. Alejandro answered with short words, without enthusiasm. When the call ended, he realized something had changed. For the first time in years, what waited for him at the office seemed irrelevant. That day, instead of feeling proud of his packed agenda, he felt empty. The image of the boy haunted him at every light, every corner. And the most disturbing part was not the poverty he had seen, but the dignity with which that child danced despite it. When the car finally stopped in front of the glass tower bearing his name, Alejandro took a deep breath. He knew he had to go in, face the shareholders, and speak with his usual firm and cold voice. But inside, an echo kept calling him. The borrowed music, the steady steps, and above all, the boy's gaze. A gaze that, in only a few seconds, had achieved what no doctor, no psychologist, no years of therapy had done. It had cracked his armor. As he walked toward the private elevator, Alejandro knew this encounter would not fade away. Even if he tried to ignore it, that gaze had marked him, and sooner or later, destiny would remind him that it was no accident. The next morning, Alejandro did not go straight to the glass tower. He ordered the driver to take a detour, as if a new compass was guiding him. He did not say why. He only asked to slow down when they approached the avenue where he had seen the boy. The traffic smelled of gasoline, fresh bread from a cart, and cheap coffee. The city spoke in horns, footsteps, and crossing voices. "Slow here," he said, pointing at the crossing. The light turned red again. As if fate understood the meeting, the boy appeared among the people. He pulled out the old speaker, blew dust from the small box, adjusted 2 worn-out wires, and let a broken song come to life. He fixed his frayed sneakers and, with a serious look, began to move. There was no applause, no loyal audience, only a street corner that seemed to breathe with his turns. Alejandro placed his hand on the handle and, for the first time in years, opened the limousine door himself. The driver tried to stop him with a glance, but the businessman was already on the sidewalk, the wind tugging at his tie. Passers-by recognized him. Some pulled out their phones, others stepped aside. The scene was strange. The man who lived behind dark glass had finally stepped onto the same ground as everyone else. The boy noticed. His dance faltered for a second, as if his body asked whether he should run. Then he continued. Alejandro did not step forward to impose his presence. He moved with respect, stopping at a careful distance. He looked at the boy, then at the speaker. In his pocket, his phone vibrated with messages from the board meeting. He ignored them. "What's your name?" he asked calmly. The boy hesitated, lowered his eyes, and placed a hand on the cardboard box. "They call me Nico." Alejandro nodded. He took 1 step closer. "Nico, I need to ask you something unusual," he said, and noticed how strange the word "need" sounded in his own mouth, a word he rarely used. He pulled out his phone. On the screen was the latest photo of Valeria, taken a week before. She was not smiling. Her eyes stared at a point that did not exist. "She's my daughter," he continued. "She can't move like before. She hasn't smiled in a long time. I want you to dance for her." The noise of the crossing seemed to drop a level. Nico stopped moving. He looked at the picture in silence, with respect, as if looking at an altar. This was not a common request. It was "not to your show and I'll pay you." It was something else, a plea with no suit. "Here?" the boy asked without irony. "Here," Alejandro confirmed. "I want to record you and bring this home. I want her to see you. I want her to hear the music you find, even when everything around is just noise." Nico took a deep breath. He adjusted his cap, tightened the loose laces of his sneakers, and raised the volume on the speaker. "All right," he said, "but I won't do tricks to impress her. I'll only dance for real." Alejandro swallowed hard. That phrase disarmed him. Dance for real. He nodded and lifted his phone. The light turned green. Cars behind them protested, but Alejandro's driver raised his hand out the window, holding back the impatience with a firm gesture. Nico began. His steps were not perfect. They were honest. He did not fight the asphalt. He listened to it. His right arm drew a slow circle, as if inviting someone to cross an invisible door. His left marked the beat of a song the speaker could not carry alone. Then came 2 short spins, a pause, a gaze that asked not for coins but for full attention. In that pause were the street, the sleepless night, the hunger, but also something more, the decision not to give up. Alejandro held the phone with both hands. For a moment, he imagined Valeria in front of that image, receiving not a performance but a message. "Out here, movement is still waiting for you." The knot in his throat returned, but this time it was less bitter. When Nico finished, he did not bow. He lowered his arms and waited. The speaker clicked off. The crossing returned to its usual noise. "Thank you," Alejandro said. "I'll pay you for your time." "Pay me if you want," the boy shrugged. "But if you do, let it be for the video and the music, not for me. I'll dance anyway." Alejandro put away his phone, surprised by such simple dignity. He took out some money and placed it in the box, but without exaggerating, just enough, without turning the gesture into a purchase. Then he breathed like someone making a responsible decision. "I want to show her this today. If she likes it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Would you dance for her again? In a quiet place, where she can see you without all this noise. Nico thought for a moment. He looked around, at his speaker, at his worn-out shoes. If it's for her, I'll come, he said. But you'll have to let me know. I sleep wherever I can. Alejandro nodded and, for the first time, shared something that for years had been hidden behind assistants and filters, a direct number. He wrote it on paper, and also saved it in the boy's phone. I'll call you today, he promised. I want it to be soon. He returned to the limousine without hurry. Before closing the door, he turned once more. Nico had resumed his routine, but now his steps seemed steadier, as if the request had cleared the air. The light turned red again. Alejandro smiled slightly. At last, a traffic light was not wasted time, but the doorway to something he did not yet understand. In his seat, he played back the video. There were no filters, no editing, no stage. And yet everything shone. Not from luxury, but from truth. Home, he told the driver. The morning's reports no longer mattered. Someone had to see that dance. The limousine stopped in front of the wrought iron gates guarding the Santori mansion. The gates opened slowly, as if measuring every second to remind everyone who was in charge inside. Nico, the boy from the traffic light, looked up with his mouth slightly open. Marble columns, gardens trimmed with surgical precision, fountains pouring crystal-clear water. It was another planet compared to the corner where he usually danced. Alejandro stepped out first. With a wave of his hand, he signaled him to follow. Nico hesitated. He still carried the speaker under one arm and a worn backpack on his shoulders. His steps were unsure, not from fear of the magnate, but because the perfection of this place made him feel like a stain on a white canvas. As soon as they crossed the main threshold, two maids exchanged looks. One of them, in charge of cleaning, pressed her lips as if she had spotted a mistake on the red carpet. The butler, a man with gray hair and a flawless suit, stepped forward with a stiff gesture. "Mr. Santori," he said softly, bowing. "Who is this boy?" Alejandro did not answer right away. He simply let his footsteps echo on the marble floor. The boy behind him felt the stairs like needles on his skin. The golden portraits of ancestors, the hanging chandeliers, the furniture with shiny inlays. Everything seemed to ask him what he was doing there. Finally, the businessman spoke calmly. "He is a guest, and he will be treated as one." The butler, though surprised, lowered his head in obedience. Not all the staff were as discreet. Two security guards whispered to each other. "What if he's hiding something? Look at how he's dressed. This isn't safe." Alejandro's glare silenced them. Neither dared to continue. As they walked through the endless hallways, Nico held the speaker tighter. His eyes moved constantly. A black grand piano in a huge room, marble statues, windows overlooking the private garden. The contrast was so brutal it was hard for him to walk. He felt that at any moment someone would point him out and throw him out. They climbed carpeted stairs. The tension was thick enough to cut. Every servant they passed looked at the boy as if he were an invisible threat. Poverty that could stain wealth. They did not know what was worse, his worn-out clothes or the quiet confidence with which he followed Alejandro without lowering his head. At last, they reached a large double door, thick and carved from wood. Alejandro placed his hand on the knob and paused. He turned to Nico. "She is here," he said gently. "I want you to dance, not for me, but for Valeria." The boy swallowed hard. He had never planned for a room like this. He knew that on the street, people watched him for a minute and then left. Here, someone was truly waiting. Alejandro opened the door. The room was bathed in the light of the afternoon. In the center, a large bed was surrounded by shelves with children's books and toys that looked new but lifeless, resting in painful silence. Valeria was there, sitting in her wheelchair, her hair tied back, her gaze fixed on the window. Not a single reaction at her father's entrance. Nico froze at the doorway, not because of the luxury, but because of the stillness of the girl. He had never seen so much quiet in such a young face, and that quiet weighed heavier than the noise of any avenue. Behind them, the staff kept watching from a distance, uneasy, as if this experiment was a mistake. No one said it out loud, but all thought the same. What could a street boy do that the world's doctors had not? Alejandro leaned toward his daughter. "Valeria, I brought someone. I want you to see him." The girl did not reply. Her gaze stayed locked on the glass. Nico, with trembling hands, turned on his speaker. A simple melody filled the room. The boy stepped forward, aware of every suspicious look at his back, but also of the only gaze that mattered, Valeria's. The butler discreetly closed the door. Outside, the staff whispered, tense, as if they feared poverty would leave marks on the marble. Inside, however, the tension was different. The meeting of two opposite worlds was about to begin. The door closed and the room fell into silence, except for the soft hum of the oxygen machine and the ticking of a hidden clock. Valeria kept her eyes on the garden outside the window, as if the trees and flowers were the only things that mattered in her frozen universe. Nico, standing just a few steps away, felt the weight of the mansion fade, until everything shrank to this small, bright space. The old speaker in his hand seemed out of place, but when he turned it on and the first weak note filled the air, something unexpected happened. The house noise disappeared. The melody was simple, almost childlike, chosen carefully so it wouldn't scare the girl. Nico closed his eyes for a moment, as if searching for the rhythm inside himself. Then, he began to move slowly. His feet slid across the carpet without a sound, as if its softness reminded him of beach sand or the dust of the street. He raised his arms gently, drawing circles in the air, and tilted his head as if greeting someone invisible. There was no audience to clap, no coins to fall into a box. Only an unmoving girl, her father watching with restrained hope, and staff behind the door trying to listen. Valeria didn't turn her head at first. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. But something shifted when the boy moved a little closer. It wasn't a sudden change, just a blink, different from the others. The sound of the speaker and the faint scrape of Nico's worn sneakers against the carpet created a kind of hypnotic whisper. It seemed like he wanted to tell a story without words, one that could only be understood through the body. Alejandro stood in a corner, afraid to move. He saw Nico's effort to be gentle, not to intrude, to turn a street language into a delicate one that might reach where the girl was locked away. The businessman found himself breathing slower, following the rhythm of those steps. From the door, the butler and a nurse watched warily, ready to step in at any moment, as if the music were a threat that could break Valeria's fragile stillness. The girl remained motionless, but a strand of hair fell onto her forehead, and for a moment, her eyes left the garden to follow Nico's movement. It was a fleeting look, almost impossible to catch, gone in an instant. Yet it was enough to make Alejandro shiver. It wasn't a smile, not even surprise, but it was the first sign that something was breaking through the shell. Nico didn't notice. He was lost in the dance. He combined a slow spin with a small jump. Not high like on the street, but restrained, because here movements needed to be whispers, not shouts. He dropped low to the ground, pressed a hand to the carpet, and slid one leg beneath his body as if drawing a flower in an invisible field. Then he rose and spread his arms, marking a beat that seemed to pulse. The music faded, softer and softer. At the end, Nico stopped in front of Valeria and lowered his gaze. Not as submission, but as a silent invitation for her to choose whether to respond. The speaker clicked off. Silence returned, heavier than before. None of the adults moved. Valeria blinked again. Her eyes rested for a moment on the boy's face. She said nothing, But when he stepped back slowly toward the door, she followed him with her gaze until he was gone. Alejandro, who had barely dared to breathe, couldn't hold back a small tear. It was a tiny gesture, yes, but it was the first time in months he had seen his daughter react to something other than the view outside her window. Nico shut off the speaker, slipped it into his backpack, and waited. He asked for nothing. He didn't know that, behind the door, the staff had traded their whispers of suspicion for silent questions. What if this worked? What if this poverty carried something money couldn't buy? Alejandro leaned down to his daughter's level. "Did you like it?" he whispered. Valeria kept her eyes on the spot where Nico had stood. Her lips didn't move, but her gaze was no longer lost in the garden. It was fixed on the doorway. And that simple shift was enough to make her father's heart beat with new strength. The butler, seeing the scene, cleared his throat lightly, a signal that, even if he didn't fully understand, he was ready to give it a chance. The nurse closed the notebook where she had written down vital signs and smiled faintly. Nico, unaware of the weight of what he had done, simply waited for instructions. "You'll come back tomorrow," Alejandro said, with a conviction that surprised everyone. "And the day after. And for as long as it takes." Nico nodded. He wasn't sure if he had the right to enter this palace again, but the man's sincerity left no room for doubt. He walked out with measured steps, leaving behind a different silence. Not the dead calm from before, but an expectation that vibrated in the air. Days passed, and true to his word, Alejandro had the gates of his mansion opened every afternoon for the street boy. Nico always arrived at the same time, carrying his speaker under one arm and wearing the same worn-out sneakers that had become part of his identity. At each visit, he walked through marble halls without looking at the golden portraits or the staff's judging stares. His eyes were fixed on only one person, Valeria. At first, his dances were quiet and delicate, as if he feared breaking more than just the stillness of the room. But as the days went on, he began to let himself flow with the music from his speaker, adding small variations. He didn't try to impress or perform flashy tricks. He danced as he had promised from the start, truly with his heart, offering each step as a gift that asked for nothing in return. Valeria remained motionless, her hands resting on her lap. Yet something in her began to change. Each time Nico finished a routine, her eyes took 1 second longer before returning to the window. Sometimes she blinked differently, like someone processing something new. One afternoon, when the boy spun gently in front of her and extended his arm, the girl's fingers moved almost imperceptibly, a tiny contraction that, in another setting, would have gone unnoticed. Alejandro, watching closely, felt a tremor of emotion. The movement lasted less than a breath, but it was real. The mansion staff began paying more attention. The chef peeked through the door when she heard music. The gardener, passing by, stopped in silence, resting his gloves on his waist to watch for a moment. The butler, who had first frowned at Nico, now studied each gesture with less judgment and more curiosity. The poverty that had triggered alarms was slowly turning into a welcomed presence. Some whispered, "Could this be a miracle?" Others avoided the word, but all agreed that something shifted in the air whenever Nico danced. Alejandro stayed home more often. He delegated meetings, postponed signings, sent assistants with excuses no one dared to question. His time seemed frozen in his daughter's room, synchronized with the rhythm of the little dancer. He didn't speak much. He only watched, breathed, and sometimes allowed himself the small smiles that once seemed impossible. Nico, for his part, discovered something new in that space. On the street, his dance was both currency and refuge, a mix of survival and art. In the mansion, his dance became a silent conversation with a girl who did not respond with words, but who, little by little, seemed to listen. He began adding softer movements, gentle sways like a lullaby, small taps of his heels that marked a faint beat. It was as if the rhythm caressed Valeria's absence, filling the void with something like hope. One afternoon, after finishing a piece, Nico dared to speak. "Hi," he whispered, barely audible. "I don't know your name, but I'm glad to see you." It was the first time the words of the street entered that room. Valeria didn't answer, but her eyes searched for the voice, moved across the boy's face, then returned to the window. Alejandro watched in silence, not interrupting. Maybe it wasn't time for answers yet, but it was time for constant presence. The dance remained a bridge. With each visit, the boy brought not only music, but also a bit of the outside world the Santori home had always avoided. He brought the smell of asphalt, the noise of engines, the distant laughter of children playing in plazas, all transformed into steps telling simple stories. How a person can still find a reason to move, even in hardship. Little by little, the staff stopped calling Nico the street boy and began using his name. The nurse recorded Valeria's small movements in her notebook, counting them as progress. The butler, though still watchful, started to understand that threats do not always come from poverty, but from prejudice. In this atmosphere of subtle change, Alejandro allowed himself to dream of something science had not promised him. He knew doctors still said his daughter's condition was irreversible, but he also knew life had placed at his door an opportunity not found in any prescription. A boy who danced without promises, only presence, inventing a language that judged no one and, without meaning to, caressed an absence. That mix of humility and perseverance was embedding itself deeper into the heart of the mansion. At the mansion, the afternoons began to take on a new rhythm. Every day at 4, Nico arrived and filled Valeria's room with movement and music. Alejandro, who was used to the strict schedules of meetings and contracts, began to organize his life around that hour. But even though the change was clear to him and to those working in the house, not everyone was convinced. One morning, Alejandro decided to speak with the doctor in charge of his daughter's rehabilitation. He had consulted many specialists. All had given him harsh diagnoses. Dr. Herrera, a well-known neurologist, received him in his private office, surrounded by diplomas and awards. He listened carefully to what Alejandro had to say. "Doctor, there's something I want to show you," the magnate said, pulling out his phone. "My daughter has been reacting differently." He played a short video of Valeria following Nico with her eyes. The doctor studied the screen without blinking, analyzing every detail of the girl's face. When the video ended, he stayed quiet for a few seconds. "I understand that this gives you hope," he finally said. "But don't fool yourself. The damage to your daughter's spinal cord is irreversible according to the science we know. What you see could be an involuntary reflex. I don't want you to lose your mind with false illusions." The words hit Alejandro hard. He had heard this speech many times, yet something inside him had changed. He no longer accepted these answers with the same resignation. "I know what the reports say, doctor, but this is different." She looks at him. Her hand moves. "Muscles can react to sensory stimuli without any conscious process," Herrera insisted. "You must be realistic. I don't want you or your daughter to suffer more when this doesn't progress." The conversation left a bitter taste. Alejandro left the office with a mix of anger and guilt. He scolded himself for getting his hopes up, but also rebelled against the idea of giving up. He remembered Valeria's face as she followed Nico. Even if it was only a reflex, wasn't it worth giving her a little joy while it lasted? He walked to his car with his head full of questions. Was it irresponsible to insist on something doctors denied? Was he exploiting the boy's hope for his own desire? At the mansion, the staff watched cautiously. The older ones whispered that they had never seen Alejandro so vulnerable. The nurse caring for Valeria noticed the girl responded better to stimuli each day. The record showed small changes. Her heart rate shifted when Nico danced, her breathing grew deeper. But she didn't dare argue against the doctor's authority. That same afternoon, when the clock struck 4, Nico arrived as usual. Alejandro greeted him with a gesture that tried to hide the weight of his earlier talk with the neurologist. "Today, just dance as always," he said. "Don't worry about anything else." Nico nodded, knowing nothing of doctors or diagnoses. He turned on the speaker and began a routine of fluid movements and precise pauses. In the middle of a spin, the door opened softly. It was Dr. Herrera, who had decided to see for himself what was happening. Alejandro had invited him that morning, hoping to convince him. The neurologist stood aside, taking mental notes. Nico wasn't intimidated. He kept dancing, ignoring the presence of the man in the white coat with the critical gaze. Valeria, feeling the music, once again turned her eyes toward the boy. Her fingers twitched in a faint tremor, barely a breath of movement. The doctor's eyes widened in surprise, and he stepped closer. After a few minutes, the music was turned off. "Did you see that?" Alejandro asked, his voice full of emotion. "I saw what you showed me," the doctor said carefully. "It's true there is motor response, but it's still not proof of neuronal recovery. However," he paused, "I must admit that the auditory and visual stimulation seems to activate areas we thought were inactive. It could be useful as complementary therapy to improve her emotional well-being, even if it won't change the diagnosis." It was the closest thing to approval Alejandro had heard in months, and even though it wasn't a promise of recovery, it was enough to strengthen his decision. Nico would keep coming, with or without medical endorsement. His daughter's well-being was worth it. The guilt still lingered. Alejandro wondered if he was forcing Valeria to interact with a stranger. He also thought of Nico. What would happen when this was over? Could he offer him a better future? Doubts lived side by side with hope. It was new, ambiguous ground, where he had to navigate without the maps of business success. The next day, Alejandro gathered his staff. He explained that the boy's presence was now a permanent decision. He asked for respect and support. Some agreed immediately, others reluctantly, but no one opposed him. They had seen Valeria's fingers move. They had seen the spark in their boss's eyes. And for the first time, they accepted that maybe, just maybe, science did not have all the answers. Alejandro's decision to have Nico return every afternoon did not remain just words. After the neurologist's visit and the evidence of small changes in Valeria, the magnate knew he had to secure the continuity of the ritual. The next day, he called Nico before he arrived and invited him to have breakfast with him in the mansion's kitchen. It was a less ostentatious space than the main dining hall, but it was full of exquisite aromas and elegant dishes. Nico, used to eating stale bread or nothing at all, stared wide-eyed at the table. Fluffy eggs, freshly squeezed orange juice, fruit cut into perfect cubes. Alejandro sat across from him, dressed in his flawless suit, wearing a serious expression. "I want to talk with you," he said. "I know you've been coming every afternoon. I want you to keep doing it. But I also want to make sure you don't go hungry or cold while you do." Nico blinked, confused. He wasn't used to anyone worrying about his basic needs. On the street, everything was immediate: food, shelter, coins. The idea of having a safe place seemed almost like a dream. "I don't need anything," he said at first instinctively. "I dance because I want to." But in his voice there was a tone of honesty. Life had taught him to be wary. Alejandro shook his head. "It's not just about dancing. I want you to eat here, to rest if you need to. My house has many empty rooms. You can use one to sleep when it's cold, or when you need a roof. It's not charity." He paused. "It's an exchange. You give us something valuable, something no one else can give Valeria. I want to give you something in return to make your life a bit easier. Do you accept?" The boy looked down at his hands, trembling and dirty despite the quick wash before coming in. It was tempting. Nights on the street could be cruel, with their threatening noises and biting cold. Accepting meant no more sleeping on benches or in dark doorways. But at what cost? He chewed on the thought while taking a piece of bread to his mouth. I accept, he finally said softly, but only if I can still be myself. I don't want people to see me differently just because I now walk through a big door. And, he added, staring straight at Alejandro, I don't want the girl to think I dance because you're paying me. I dance because I feel it. I don't want that to change. Alejandro smiled with an honesty he rarely showed in public. I don't want to change you. I want to help you. And as for my daughter, I want her to keep believing you dance, because you want to make her feel good. Because that's the truth. From that day on, a pact without contracts, small print, or signatures was sealed with a handshake. Alejandro gave Nico a small room near the kitchen, away from the main halls. It was simple. A clean bed, a wardrobe, a window looking out to the back garden. The boy looked at it in awe. He hadn't seen a mattress like that in years. A soft sheet, a fluffy pillow, a safe roof. It was like an oasis. The staff reacted with murmurs of opinion. Some saw it as extravagance, others as madness. But most, having already felt the effect of Nico's dancing on Valeria, began to see the boy as someone deserving of support. The cook prepared hot meals for him and invited him to sit at the small table used by the staff. The gardener taught him how to care for plants in his free time. Even the butler, the strictest of all, softened and explained how to use linen towels without ruining them. Nico, timid at first, began to open up. In the afternoons, after dancing, he stayed to talk with some of the workers. He told them about life on the street, about friends who slept in parks, about how he had learned to dance by watching other kids on internet videos from store windows. He spoke of fears and hopes, not realizing he was slowly becoming part of an improvised family. Meanwhile, Alejandro felt that his house was no longer just a museum of memories. With Nico's presence, the halls filled with laughter, improvised music, shoes marked with garden dirt. Valeria still did not speak, but her gaze grew more alive. Sometimes, when the boy walked past her at the end of a dance and bowed respectfully, the girl seemed to understand. Her eyes followed him. Her breathing matched the rhythm she had just heard. It was as if, even without moving, her spirit went for a walk every afternoon alongside Nico's steps. One of those afternoons, after Nico had danced and eaten, he stayed in Valeria's room while Alejandro spoke with her. The father stroked his daughter's hand and told her stories of places he had visited. Nico listened quietly. At one point, Alejandro turned to him. Tell her something about you, he asked. It doesn't have to be about the street if you don't want. Something you like, a story. Nico was surprised. He wasn't used to anyone wanting to hear him. He smiled shyly and began to share a dream. One day, he wanted to be part of a professional dance group. He spoke with bright eyes, as if in his mind the street became a stage with lights and applause. Valeria watched him closely. She didn't speak, but the room filled with a new energy, the energy of a shared dream. Alejandro listened in silence, nodding, knowing that this boy was not only helping his daughter, but teaching him to see beyond contracts and deals. For the first time in his life, an agreement without papers was the most valuable one he had ever signed. The afternoons continued with the same peaceful routine. Nico arrived, danced, ate, and went to rest. As the days passed, something wonderful began to happen. The silence that once filled Valeria's room started to overflow with small sounds only attentive hearts could notice. They were light sighs, deep breaths, inhalations that matched the improvised music. No one spoke of it aloud for fear of breaking the spell, but everyone noticed the girl was more present, more connected to the moment. Nico, who was used to dancing in empty halls filled with cars and lifeless conversations, discovered a new stage in that room. It was no longer just about moving himself. It was about translating what he felt into gestures that could be read by someone who could not move. He began to watch Valeria's eyes more carefully. Each time her pupils widened or shrank at a movement, he took mental notes. If she liked the soft circles, he repeated them. If she blinked at the rhythm of his heel taps, he brought them back. It was a choreography of tenderness, where steps born on the street were refined in a room that, little by little, seemed to open to life. One day, while repeating a slow arm movement to a soft melody, Nico noticed something. Valeria's little finger lifted almost imperceptibly at the exact moment he marked the beat. He froze, looked at the girl, and tapped his foot again. She responded by moving the finger once more. It was the first time they established a real dialogue, not a conversation in words, but a language of their own that they were creating together. Alejandro, watching from the corner, felt a new emotion burst inside his chest. He realized that music and dance were not only bringing joy to Valeria, but also building a bridge between two worlds. The businessman walked up to his daughter's chair, took her hand, and counted aloud with Nico, marking the beats with his palm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. At first, the girl did not react visibly, but her eyes followed her father's hand and the boy's movement. After several tries, her little finger rose again on the count of 8, and the room exploded into a silence full of smiles. It was a tiny step, but to them it meant more than any figure in the medical reports. The staff began to take part in the new routine. The nurse, instead of staying by the door recording vital signs, entered and counted softly with the others. The gardener clapped his thighs in rhythm while pretending not to. The cook hummed traditional tunes, and Nico wove them into his movements. Even the butler, always so formal, allowed himself a small approving gesture at the end of each session. Without realizing it, they were all learning to count heartbeats in 8 counts. Valeria, for her part, began to show small changes beyond the tiny movements. Her eyes no longer stayed fixed on the window, but focused on what happened in the room. Her cheeks seemed to regain a bit of color. One rainy afternoon, when the light was dim, Nico decided to dance without music. His sneakers hit the carpet with a dry rhythm. Alejandro, without saying a word, started clapping along to the beat. The girl followed each sound with her eyes, and when the dance ended, a spark of curiosity shone in her gaze. She could not smile, but her lips trembled slightly, as if trying to remember how. These moments were carefully recorded by the nurse, who began comparing her notes with those of earlier days. She saw that Valeria's heart rate rose during the dances and returned to normal afterward, but always stayed a little higher than before she had met Nico. They were signs of emotional and physical stimulation that the neurologist could not ignore. One day, Nico brought wooden sticks he had found in the kitchen. He handed them to Alejandro and asked him to mark the beat together. At first, the idea seemed ridiculous to a businessman used to leading board meetings. But after a short hesitation, the magnate took the sticks and began to tap them. The sound echoed strongly through the room, and Valeria blinked to the rhythm. Then, in a moment of courage, Alejandro asked the nurse to put down her notebook and join them. She smiled and agreed. The room filled with rhythmic sounds. They all marked the beat together, and Nico danced guided by the improvised rhythm. It was the choreography of a family built without blood ties. And so, between wooden sticks, counts, and gentle turns, a language of their own was woven. Everyone learned to read in Valeria's eyes, to mark beats with their hands that went beyond the hours of a clock. For Nico, that room became a stage where he didn't just dance to be seen, but to connect. For Alejandro, rhythm became the purest way to reach his daughter. For Valeria, the beats were a doorway back to the world she thought she had lost. And for the staff, The choreography of tenderness became as vital a routine as polishing marble or watering roses. Before we continue this journey full of emotions and hope, I invite you to support this project. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and give this video a like. That way, you can join us in every chapter and never miss how this story keeps transforming lives. Now then, let's continue with the story. The mansion buzzed with new energy thanks to Nico's presence and Valeria's progress. Yet outside its walls, the world kept turning and watching. News that Alejandro Santori had taken in a street boy began to spread little by little. At first, they were whispers in social circles. A rumor told in an exclusive club, a conversation between wives in a luxury salon. With time, the rumor turned into headlines. Who is the boy living in the magnate's mansion? Santori's mysterious guest stirs up shareholders. Charity or extravagance? The media soon knocked on the door of the Santori company. A journalist from a financial magazine dared to ask at a press conference, "Mr. Santori, is it true you have a homeless boy living in your home? Don't you fear for your safety and that of your daughter?" The question, though polite, carried judgment. Alejandro answered with a serious gesture. "In my house live my family and those I choose. The rest is not public business." His voice left no room for more questions, but curiosity did not vanish. At the next shareholders' meeting, the mood was tense. The men and women, most more concerned with numbers than names, looked at one another, waiting for someone to speak. Finally, one of the veterans, a white-haired man with a calm voice, cleared his throat. "Alejandro," he said, "you've made risky decisions that brought us profits, and we respect that. But this," he paused, weighing his words, "don't you think bringing a stranger from the street into your home is a vulnerability? What will investors say if they see your personal life interfering with our business?" Alejandro leaned forward, resting his hands on the dark wooden table. "What I do in my house is my business," he answered firmly. "My daughter is improving with Nico's presence. That concerns me more than your opinion." "We're not talking about opinions," continued another, younger shareholder. "We're talking about reputation. Shares can fall because of this. There are already rumors you've neglected some projects to stay home. Competitors smell blood." The room filled with nervous murmurs. Alejandro took a deep breath. He knew his life was scrutinized to the smallest detail, and that every decision affected millions of dollars. But he also knew his daughter's happiness was worth more than any number. "If anyone here thinks my being home is a problem for business, they can leave," he said calmly, but with steel in his voice. "I am willing to face the consequences." An uncomfortable silence followed. No one stood. No one gave up their shares. They all knew that despite their words, they depended on the man in front of them. Shame became a ghost in the room. Alejandro remembered his own past, when as a boy he had to fight for space and recognition in a world that didn't believe in him. Looking around, he saw in their faces a reflection of his own old ambition. People who had forgotten why they once worked hard, now ready to judge him for opening his home to a boy with talent. In the days that followed, the headlines continued. Some TV shows tried to interview Alejandro's neighbors, who told exaggerated stories. Tabloids suggested the magnate was compensating for past guilt. Social media split between those praising his humanity and those accusing him of showing off charity. Alejandro did not respond. He had learned outside noise was inevitable. His priority was what happened inside his house. In the mansion, the staff felt the tension. There were quick conversations in the kitchen about the news, but they always stopped when Nico walked in. Valeria, unaware of headlines, kept receiving the boy with her quiet attention. Every afternoon, the rhythms and wooden sticks became a refuge from the noise outside. Nico knew nothing of the controversy. On the street, reputation was a luxury. His world was survival and art. In the house, his only concern was finding the best way to reach Valeria and help her out of her silence. One afternoon, after dancing, Alejandro sat by the fireplace with his hands clasped and Nico at his side. "Have you noticed what people are saying about you?" he asked, curious. Nico shook his head. "I don't have a TV," he shrugged. "People always talk." Alejandro looked at him and smiled with a touch of sadness. "Sometimes the noise outside can be loud, but the only thing that matters is what happens here. Remember that, kid?" Nico nodded. For him, this house was a new world where he could eat hot food, sleep without fear, and dance freely. Approval or criticism outside mattered little. Alejandro was learning from him to value the essential. Dr. Herrera, aware of the controversy, returned to the mansion one afternoon. He joined the circle of wooden sticks and, for the first time, marked the rhythm shyly. At the end, he approached Alejandro. "I don't understand reputations or shares," he said. "But I see a girl who responds and a father who smiles. I believe in medicine, but also in what makes people happy. Maybe I should have seen it sooner." The shame others tried to impose dissolved with those words. Alejandro smiled and nodded. The ghosts of the boardroom would keep speaking, but in the mansion's main hall, the rhythm of the sticks and Nico's steps was the only voice that truly mattered. The mansion, despite the outside pressure, remained a refuge where a different story was being woven. Between dance sessions and shared silences, a moment came that would change the bond between Nico and Alejandro in a deeper way. It happened one night, after an especially emotional session. Valeria had tried to move 2 fingers instead of 1, and the air was filled with hope. Alejandro walked Nico to the kitchen so he could eat before bed. While they had dinner, he realized that even though he knew who the boy was now, he knew almost nothing about his past. "Nico," he began carefully, "I've never asked you about your life before you came here. You don't have to tell me if you don't want, but I'd like to know. How did you end up dancing on that corner?" The boy played with his fork over the plate of pasta for a few seconds. He had avoided that topic for weeks. On the street, every person carries a story heavier than a sack of stones. To share it is to carry it again. He looked Alejandro in the eyes and decided to speak. "I wasn't born in this city," he said softly. "I lived with my mom in a neighborhood where everything was hard. My dad," he paused, searching for words, "left us when I was very little. Mom worked cleaning houses, but the money was never enough. I started dancing after seeing some kids in a plaza. I thought it could help her. I learned fast. People gave me coins. For a while it worked." Alejandro nodded, without interrupting. "But things changed when she got sick," Nico continued. "We had no money for medicine. I tried dancing more, but it wasn't enough. One night, she told me to leave for the city. She said there would be more chances there. She didn't want me to watch her die." His voice shook. "I ran away with some clothes and the speaker. I left her alone. When I came back," his eyes filled with tears, "she was gone. The house was empty. I asked around, but no one knew. Since then, the street has been my home." Alejandro felt a knot in his throat. He didn't know what to say. He placed his hand on the table, a silent gesture of support. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I can't imagine what that must have been for you." Nico wiped his tears with the back of his hand and took a breath. "I'm not telling you this for pity," he explained. "I'm saying it because," he glanced around, as if he could see Valeria even though she wasn't there. "Because here I feel safe, and because I think she needs to know where I come from to trust me. I don't want her to see me as a stranger with no story. I've lost too, like her. Not the same way, but I did." Alejandro nodded again. The story woke something in his memory. He remembered his own childhood in a humble neighborhood before becoming the magnate he was. His parents had struggled so he could study. He had worked from a young age to get out. He had sold his memories of games and laughter in exchange for contracts, numbers, and power. He had promised that when he succeeded, he would be happy. And in part, he achieved it, but at a cost. Distance from his family, from his roots. He had forgotten what it was like to have nothing but hope. He leaned back in his chair and, for the first time in a long while, spoke about himself without the armor of the businessman. "You know," he began, "my father was a carpenter. My mother sewed to make a living. We were 6 siblings. The house was small, but it was always noisy and full of joy. I wanted more. I saw men in suits and cars and thought, I want to be there. I obsessed over studying and working. I left my people behind to climb the ladder. I made it, but I lost a lot along the way. I made money, but I also caused harm. I thought I had to buy everything. And when Valeria," he stopped to swallow hard. "When Valeria had her accident, I realized there are things money can't fix." Nico listened quietly. Alejandro went on, "I'm not telling this to compare us. I know our stories are different, but now I see we both left something behind to look for something else. You ran away to survive. I ran from my origins to succeed. And maybe, because of that, we met." The boy nodded slowly. "Maybe," he whispered. "Sometimes I think Mom didn't want me to see her go because she wanted me to remember what it was to live, not what it was to die. Dancing keeps me connected to that. And now, with Valeria, I feel like I'm giving something back to someone, even if it isn't her. It's a way to, I don't know, forgive myself for not being there." Alejandro took a deep breath. "I promise that as long as you're here, you'll have a safe place. I want to help you search for your mother, if possible." Nico looked at him, surprised, with a mix of hope and fear. "I don't know if I'll find her," he said. "Maybe she's gone for good. But if we can look, thank you." That night, when they each went to their rooms, the mansion felt different. Nico's confession had tied the two of them together in ways they couldn't imagine. In Valeria's room, the girl slept peacefully, unaware of the story shared, but touched by the new bond between her father and the boy. The past had stepped in, bringing pain and lessons. Alejandro understood he couldn't change what he had done, but he could build a different present. Nico, for his part, felt his story had been heard, and maybe, by telling it to someone who didn't judge him, he had taken a step toward healing. Both realized that trust cannot be bought or sold. It is built with tears, confessions, and mutual support. The day after Nico's confession, the mansion felt charged with contained energy. The stories shared the night before could not be seen, but they were felt in the way Alejandro and the boy now looked at each other with more complicity and respect. There was a bond that did not depend on contracts or promises, but on a mutual understanding of pain and the desire for healing. That afternoon, as always, music filled Valeria's room. Nico had thought of a special rhythm, more marked than other days, as if he wanted to test something he sensed. He began with soft steps, dragging his sneakers across the carpet to make a dull sound. Then he lifted one heel and tapped the floor rhythmically. 1, 2, 3, 4. Alejandro, standing near his daughter, marked each beat with his hands, just as they had practiced days before. The nurse counted silently and noted vital signs. The butler watched from the door with the seriousness of someone secretly allowing himself to be moved. On the 5th tap, something happened. It wasn't a big movement, not a smile, not a cry. It was barely a tremor, like a physical sigh. The index finger of Valeria's left hand lifted slightly. A gesture that for anyone else would be involuntary, but for those in the room, it was a spark that lit everything. She didn't move her head, she didn't turn her eyes. Only that finger responded to the rhythm, like a tiny story inside a vast silence. Nico stopped at once. He looked at Alejandro, who held his breath. The nurse put down her pen, and leaned in to check. She whispered Valeria's name and gently touched her hand. At first there was no reaction, but when Nico tapped the floor again, the finger moved once more. The movement was clumsy, slow, but it was a response. Everyone's hearts seemed to stop for a second and then beat stronger. Alejandro knelt in front of his daughter. "Do you feel it?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "If you hear me, move your finger again." Nico watched the girl closely. He tapped his foot once more, marking the beat. Seconds passed like eternity, and then the index finger rose and fell once again. The gesture was so small that anyone could have mistaken it for a reflex, but for those present, it was a miracle. The father carefully embraced his daughter without moving her, avoiding breaking the moment. Tears fell from his eyes. He smiled and allowed himself to cry as he hadn't since the accident that left her in a wheelchair. "Thank you," he murmured to Nico. "Thank you for not giving up." Nico wiped sweat from his forehead and smiled humbly. He couldn't believe what he was seeing either. It was the first real proof that his dance and the connection he had built with the girl were having a physical effect. He had dreamed of this moment, but seeing it in reality made his chest tighten. The staff, who had heard stories about miracles but had never seen one, broke the silence with soft applause. The nurse quickly wrote the movement in her notes, her eyes shining. The ever-stoic butler placed a hand on his chest, as if to confirm his own heart was still beating. The cook, when she heard, later ran to light a candle in the family's private chapel. After the first wave of emotion, Alejandro called Dr. Herrera. He wanted to share the news. He wanted a professional witness to confirm what they had seen. The doctor arrived that same afternoon. He came in with his usual serious face and asked to repeat the exercise. Nico tapped the floor. Alejandro asked his daughter to move her finger. On the third try, the finger lifted slightly. The neurologist frowned, leaned closer, touched her hand, and slowly nodded. "It's a motor response," he admitted. "We can't yet say anything about recovery, but this means there are active neural connections. It could be a sign of progress." For the first time, the neurologist seemed hopeful. Alejandro smiled. Hope now had a name inside his house. For him, what mattered wasn't a final diagnosis. It was that small tremor that changed everything. Until then, hope had been a fragile word, whispered so as not to sound naive. Now he could say it out loud. The news of the finger movement did not leak outside the mansion. Alejandro wanted to keep it in the family. He didn't need headlines this time. He needed to protect his daughter and Nico from the media storm. Even so, inside the house, the story was told again and again. Each person repeated the scene with the passion of someone recounting history. For them, it was. That night, before leaving, Nico walked up to Valeria and spoke softly, almost a whisper. "Thank you for trusting me," he said. "What happened today is our secret. Tomorrow, we'll keep counting." Valeria didn't answer, but her finger moved slightly, as if sealing the deal. Alejandro saw that gesture and felt that hope, once desperate and fragile, was now real, materialized in the smallest but most powerful of signs. He knew the road ahead was long, that a finger movement did not mean his daughter would walk again. But it was enough to make the world change color. It was a spark that lit up a different future. Valeria's progress remained an intimate secret inside the mansion, yet Nico's presence and the rumor that something special was happening behind the gates could not stay hidden forever. One day, while staff went out to buy supplies, an employee shared a short video with a friend, without bad intention. It showed Nico dancing in the garden, far from Valeria's room, while sunlight filtered through the trees. The friend, touched by the story, uploaded it to social media with the caption, "The boy who dances for Santori's daughter." Within hours, the video was shared thousands of times. The city, already buzzing with curiosity, turned to their screens. People who had never met Valeria or Nico began to comment. Some praised the boy's talent. Others criticized Alejandro for exploiting the story to clean his image. On forums, people asked, "When will we see the girl walk?" As if the miracle were a scheduled show. Paparazzi, always alert for sparks, gathered at the mansion gates with cameras and microphones, searching for the perfect shot to confirm or deny the rumors. Alejandro learned of the situation when, one morning, while briefly in the city, he saw his own face on a giant screen with a headline, "The billionaire who bought a miracle?" His phone filled with messages and calls from friends, enemies, and journalists. The fact that the video had gone viral forced him to make a decision. He knew he couldn't stop people from talking, but he could protect his daughter and Nico from being turned into shallow headlines. He returned to the mansion and gathered his staff. With a firm but calm voice, he explained the situation. "What happens here is ours. We don't need the world's approval. If anyone wants to share something, think twice. And if you're not sure, come to me first," he said, not blaming anyone directly, but making clear they had to be discreet. Nico discovered the commotion by chance, when he saw his face on a magazine cover while crossing the street back to the mansion. He stopped confused, reading how they called him the prodigy boy or the new charity project. He felt vulnerable and, once inside, asked Alejandro if he should keep coming. "Of course," the magnate replied. "We can't control what people say, but we can control what we do. Your dance is for Valeria, not for them. Don't let their noise take away its meaning." Still, the noise didn't stop. The next day, a reporter hid among the garden trees and took photos of Nico carrying the speaker. Another hidden camera caught Valeria looking out the window, though her face wasn't visible and the context wasn't clear. The images were sold to a tabloid, which hinted the girl had reacted miraculously thanks to the boy. Comments split between disbelief and demands that the family show the full miracle. Public opinion, as fickle as ever, demanded instant results, forgetting that healing takes time, and this story was not a show. The outside pressure began to weigh on the staff. The cook feared going out in the mornings because people asked her questions. The gardener was photographed without permission, and his face appeared online with absurd speculations. The butler increased security at the entrance, and Alejandro hired a team of lawyers to review publications and ensure legal limits were respected. Neurologist Herrera, aware of the media chaos, decided to make a short public statement to slow the wave of expectations. "The girl's recovery is a long and private process," he told reporters. "This is not about instant miracles, but about therapy and time. We ask for respect and patience." His words didn't silence rumors completely, but at least shifted the conversation. More sensible voices began to say it was a private matter that should remain offstage. Even so, paparazzi still lingered, waiting for a picture, a gesture. Inside the mansion, Alejandro decided the best response was to keep going with their routine. He wouldn't let public curiosity slow down his daughter's therapy. He asked Nico to keep dancing as always, though now they closed all curtains and added more privacy. During one session, while music filled the room, voices were heard outside the gate. Alejandro felt a chill of frustration. He pulled the curtains slightly and saw people holding up phones, trying to catch something. He shut it again and breathed deeply. He couldn't control the world, but he could shield his home. Valeria remained unaware of the storm. In her silent world, what mattered was the rhythm, eye contact with Nico, the movement of her finger. She stayed within her own time, a time that didn't depend on clicks or shares. Alejandro then understood that patience would be his best weapon against public opinion. The viral video brought not only curiosity, but offers. A TV producer contacted Alejandro's office, proposing an exclusive documentary about the story. He offered huge sums, promising a moving and authentic story. Alejandro rejected it without hesitation. Later, an event businessman proposed organizing shows with Nico in theaters, under the excuse of raising funds for Valeria's rehab. Alejandro rejected that too. He knew that behind sweet words was the intention to exploit the boy's talent. In a late-night talk, Alejandro shared the proposals with Nico. "They want you to dance for cameras, to make shows," he explained. "What do you think?" Nico frowned. "I dance because I love it, and because I want to help Valeria. Not so they can film me and sell me. I don't want to be part of that." "Then we are too," Alejandro answered. The city's noise didn't fade, but inside the mansion, the decision to keep the process private stayed strong. Public opinion demanded quick miracles, but true miracles, if they exist, are slow-cooked, at the pace of a body taking its time to return, and of a heart learning to beat no matter the headlines. The media noise continued, even though Alejandro and his team had taken steps to protect the mansion. But the viral video of Nico had attracted people who moved in the shadows, looking for opportunities where others saw only humanity. One afternoon, while Nico left the mansion through a side path to go to the market, a man approached him. He wore an expensive suit, carried a stylish briefcase, and had a salesman's smile that never reached his eyes. "You're the boy from the video," the man said, extending his hand. "My name is Ricardo. I work with young talent. I've brought many to success. What you do is amazing. The world should see you on a stage. I can make you a star." Nico, surprised, looked down. He wasn't used to that kind of attention. "I don't dance to be famous," he answered. "I dance because I like it and because," he thought for a second, "because I help someone." Ricardo wasn't discouraged. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder full of printed contracts. "Look, I'm not talking about just any success," he insisted. "You could earn a lot of money. You could have your own show. Imagine international tours, TV programs. And of course, part of what you make could go to the girls' rehab. Everyone would win. Even Mr. Santori would benefit from the good press. Don't you think you deserve it?" Nico felt a shiver. It was tempting to think of money to help Valeria, maybe even to look for his mother. But he also felt this man didn't understand what was at stake. He bit his lip and said, "I don't know. I would have to ask Alejandro." The man nodded quickly, taking it as an open door. "Perfect. Give me his number. I'll talk to him. He's a businessman. He'll understand a good opportunity." Nico shook his head. "No, I don't want him to think I do this for money. Let me tell him. If he wants, he'll call you." Ricardo didn't push further. He handed Nico a card and left, making it clear he expected news. Nico kept the card in his pocket, feeling uneasy. That night, Nico went to Alejandro's office. "Today someone spoke to me," he said, holding the card. "A man wants me to dance in shows. He says it could help Valeria. I don't trust him, but I wanted to tell you." Alejandro read the card in silence. He recognized the name. Ricardo was known in the entertainment world for aggressive deals. His first reaction was natural. Think about numbers, consider possibilities. With money, they could hire more specialists, improve therapies. But something inside stopped him. He remembered the neurologist's words, the story shared with Nico, the way his daughter had responded to rhythm when nobody believed she could. Money hadn't made any of that happen. Trust and time had. "What do you think?" he asked, handing the card back to Nico. "I don't like it," the boy said. "I don't want to be used. I don't want people to think I dance for money. And I don't want Valeria to believe I help her because I get paid." "And if we need money for her rehab?" Alejandro asked, still doubtful. "You don't need more money," Nico said honestly. "You need patience. This isn't fast. And if money was the answer, your daughter would already be healed, right? The boy's simple words hit Alejandro harder than any number. It wasn't a scolding. It was an obvious truth he had missed. He gave a sad smile and nodded. "You're right," he admitted. "Since we met you, I've learned not everything can be bought. Thank you for saying it. I won't do anything without asking you. And if you don't want it, we won't do it." Nico sighed in relief. "Then let's tear it up," he said, ripping the card in two. Alejandro felt unexpected pride at that gesture. For the first time, he broke a business opportunity without regret. It was a broken deal of trust avoided, because for the first time, he chose to listen instead of buy. That night, Ricardo called Alejandro himself, insisting with huge numbers and promises of fame. Alejandro cut him off. "I'm not interested," he said firmly. "What happens here has no price. Thank you for your offer, but we won't talk again." He hung up, feeling strangely free. The next day, he told the staff what happened. He asked them not to listen to anyone offering money for Valeria's story or Nico's talent. They all agreed. They understood now that their loyalty was not in their salary, but in the mission they had taken: protect the girl and support the boy. Nico kept dancing, with no promises and no contracts. Alejandro kept watching, learning to listen before deciding. That day, while walking in the garden, Alejandro met the butler, who had been with him for years. "I've never seen you rip up a card like that, sir," the butler said with a smile. "I had never seen myself like this either," Alejandro answered. "It's never too late to learn, right?" They both laughed. It was a new kind of laugh, one born not from a joke, but from the relief of making the right choice. They had rejected a dirty offer that tried to exploit Nico, and with it, they had protected not only the girl and the boy, but also the healing process that, slow but steady, was taking place within those walls. The change in Valeria, though small, had lit a spark of hope in everyone. The mansion breathed optimism, but life rarely follows a straight path. 1 week after the first finger movement, while Nico danced to a brighter melody and Valeria followed him with her eyes, fate struck without warning. It was a rainy afternoon. The sound of rain matched the rhythm of the music in the room. Nico moved gently, marking the beat with his foot, when suddenly Valeria leaned forward slightly. No one expected that her still body could shift in such a way. The wheelchair moved just a little, and the weak girl lost balance. In an instant, she slipped from the chair and fell to the floor, her head hitting the carpet. The scream that tore from Alejandro's throat was raw, a sound he had never made before. "Valeria!" he cried, rushing to her, his heart racing. The nurse reacted quickly. She knelt, placed a hand under the girl's neck, and told Nico to stop the music. The boy, frozen in horror, didn't know what to do. His eyes filled with tears, convinced that his dance had caused the fall. "Don't move her," the nurse ordered firmly. "I'll check her signs." She pulled out a small flashlight and checked Valeria's eyes. The girl was conscious but frightened, staring at the ceiling. Her lips moved faintly, trying to speak but failing. The rain pounded the windows like a different beat no one wanted to hear. Alejandro felt everything collapse. Guilt flooded him. It had been his idea to bring the boy, to push her to move, to allow dancing in a room without securing the chair properly. He blamed himself for not taking extra precautions. The nurse calmed him. "The chair wasn't locked," she explained without judgment. "We'll check her neck and back." The doctor was called. Herrera arrived within minutes, carefully examining Valeria, asking if she felt pain. Though she couldn't speak, she blinked once when he pressed her neck. The doctor sighed. "It doesn't look like a serious injury, but we need a hospital scan." Nico watched from the corner, his small body hunched. He felt unbearable weight. He blamed himself for choosing a faster rhythm, for laughing moments before, as if his joy had triggered disaster. Alejandro noticed his face and placed a hand on his shoulder. "This isn't your fault," he whispered, though he himself was drowning in guilt. "These things happen." At the hospital, the scan confirmed no new damage. Still, the fall left a bruise and a deep scare that reminded everyone progress was not a straight line. That night, back in the mansion, the house was silent. Staff walked softly, as if any noise could shatter the fragile calm. Guilt hung in the air like a heavy shadow. Alejandro locked himself in his office, replaying the fall in his mind. He blamed himself for letting hope carry him away. He thought of ending the dance sessions, of sending Nico away with money, of closing the door to risk. The storm wasn't just outside. It raged inside him. Nico, in his room, couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, wondering if he should leave. If his presence brought danger, if his dance could cause harm, was it right to stay? He remembered the promise he had made to Valeria. Memories of his mother, of nights on the street, of people pushing him away out of fear, filled his mind. Would Alejandro push him away too? The next morning, Alejandro gathered the staff in the hall. His eyes were red from a sleepless night. "Yesterday we faced a terrible scare," he began. "Valeria is safe, thank God. Guilt is an unwelcome guest. It will make us doubt every step we take. But we cannot let it paralyze us. We made a mistake. We didn't secure the chair. That can be fixed. What we cannot fix is giving up. I will not stop this process. Nico will continue coming. But we will take safety measures." The butler nodded, understanding. The nurse suggested a stronger harness and railings. Everyone agreed to be more careful. When Nico entered the hall, he thought they would ask him to leave. Alejandro walked to him and spoke before the boy could say a word. "This wasn't your fault. I know you feel guilty, but you won't leave. We need your help more than ever. And you must know, you also have the right to be afraid." Nico was speechless. His eyes filled with tears, but this time of relief, not sadness. "I thought it would be better if I didn't come anymore." "No," Alejandro answered. "If I've learned anything, it's that we don't move forward by giving up. My daughter's life depends on all of us having the courage to continue." The storm had left its mark on the mansion. Everyone learned that healing was not a path of constant victories, but of steps forward and setbacks. They also learned that blaming each other would solve nothing. What could truly close the open door was guilt, if they let it. They decided they would not. That night, when the rain had cleared and the sky was calm, Alejandro, Nico, and Valeria sat together in silence. There was no music yet. They needed to rebuild trust, strengthen the chair, reorganize the room. But they knew the rhythm would return, and when it did, it would come with more care and more courage. In a symbolic gesture, Nico placed his hands on the back of the chair, as if to hold it steady himself. Alejandro bent down and kissed his daughter's forehead, and she blinked twice, as if to say, "I'm here. Let's keep going." After the fall and the scare that shook the mansion, the routine became an act of courage. There was fear of another accident, but also the certainty that giving up would mean moving backwards. Nico, who had always seen himself as just a street learner, discovered he had something valuable to teach. Together with the nurse, he began planning sessions where he didn't only dance for Valeria, but invited her to join in new ways. They started with simple exercises. Nico placed his hand over Valeria's and showed her how to tap the table softly with her fingers to mark a beat. At first, she didn't react. Her hand seemed rigid, like an object, but with patience and repetition, her index finger gave slow, hesitant taps. Each time it happened, Nico celebrated with a smile and a sign of approval. Slowly, Valeria began to understand that this was an exchange. Her movements created a response in the outside world, a way of asking through her body. At the same time, Nico taught some of the staff basic dance steps and coordination exercises. The cook practiced moving her feet in 8 counts while stirring sauce, laughing at herself. The gardener tried simple steps while trimming roses. These small moments broke the stiffness of the mansion and helped everyone understand the importance of rhythm, not only in music, but in life itself. Alejandro faced a harder lesson: letting go of control. He had always been the one to decide when and how things should be done. Now, he had to learn to watch without ordering, to let things flow without knowing the result right away. The nurse suggested he stop giving instructions during the sessions. At first, it was hard for him to stay quiet. He wanted to tell Valeria to move her hand, to count, to follow Nico. But he held back. He sat in a corner, breathed deeply, and repeated to himself, "Trust." One day, while they practiced tapping on the table, Valeria lifted both her index and middle finger in a timid move, as if she wanted Nico's attention. He leaned closer and smiled. "Do you want something?" he asked. Valeria moved a finger. Nico pulled out a small bell he had brought from the kitchen. "If you want me to start again, ring the bell," he suggested. Valeria looked at the bell, then at her finger, and with effort that seemed enormous, slid it to touch the metal. A faint sound filled the room. It was the first time the girl asked for something on her own since the accident. Nico looked at Alejandro, who watched with teary eyes. It was a huge moment hidden in a tiny gesture. That same night, Alejandro spoke to his daughter. "Today you asked Nico for something," he whispered. "I'm proud of you. From now on, if you want anything, just say it. You have your voice in your fingers." Valeria's eyes shone, and Alejandro chose to believe she understood. From then on, he treated her as if she understood everything. He began asking her, "Do you want to hear music? Do you want Nico to dance? Do you want to be alone?" For each question, he suggested a finger signal as a response. It took time, but when she answered, Alejandro felt another barrier fall away. Nico took his new role as teacher seriously. With Alejandro's phone, under supervision, he looked up videos about music therapy. He copied exercises, adapted them to Valeria, and experimented. One day, he tied colorful ribbons to her fingers and asked her to move a certain one when a rhythm played. It didn't always work, but the laughter when it failed was as healing as the success. Courage wasn't just facing the fear of another accident. It was learning to live with vulnerability. Nico learned to admit when he was tired and needed rest. Valeria learned to ask for breaks by ringing the bell 3 times. Alejandro learned to trust the boy's instincts and let his daughter have a voice. The nurse and the butler grew too. The nurse by trying new methods, the butler by letting go of strict routines and allowing spontaneity. At a key moment, when Alejandro once again gave an instruction without thinking, Nico stopped, looked at him, and said softly but firmly, "She knows what she needs. We're only here to accompany her, not to decide for her." It was a gentle but sharp reminder that control isn't always protection. Alejandro nodded, feeling both ashamed and grateful. He realized his obsession with control could be more of a barrier than a help. As weeks passed, Valeria began moving more than one finger. Some days, she pointed toward the door, showing she wanted to go to the garden. Nico would wheel her outside, always secured, and dance for her under the sun. Other times, she moved her finger to ask for a story. Alejandro, who once hired professional storytellers, started telling her his own childhood memories. How his father taught him to build a toy, the first time he tasted ice cream. Valeria blinked at the end of each story, as if asking for another. Practicing courage was not just about facing fear, but about adapting and listening. Nico was no longer only a dancer. He had become a patient teacher. Valeria was no longer just a girl in a chair. She was beginning to communicate. Alejandro was no longer just a billionaire buying solutions. He was a father learning to trust and let go. Together, They were becoming a small community sustained by daily gestures, by rhythm, and by a new way of living. The lesson of courage inside the mansion had grown strong. Alejandro, Nico, and Valeria had found new ways to talk, to support each other, and to keep moving forward despite their fears. Still, Alejandro felt they needed a symbolic moment, something that showed how far they had come. He remembered that, before the accident, Valeria loved the theater. The lights, the costumes, the magic when the curtain rose. He decided to recreate that feeling, but in a safe and private way. Without telling his staff, he called an old friend who owned a theater in the city center. He asked to rent it for one night. No audience, no press. Just the stage, soft lights, and the freedom to use it as a private space. The owner, touched, agreed. He prepared the theater for 3 people and left only one row of warm lights on. At sunset, Alejandro brought Nico and Valeria to the theater. The girl was wrapped in a blanket, watching carefully. She didn't know where they were going, but the tone in her father's voice told her it was something special. As they entered, the smell of wood, curtains, and dust greeted them like an old friend. The empty hall felt like a sleeping giant. The stage, lit by one soft light, waited like a sacred place. "This place is for you," Alejandro whispered to Valeria. "For you and for Nico. Tonight, no audience, no cameras. Only us. A gift for the 3 of us." Nico walked to the center of the stage and took a deep breath. He felt small in the huge space. He thought of all the dancers who had once performed there, of the applause that had filled those walls. Then he looked at Valeria, who stared at the stage with wide eyes. He took off his worn shoes and replaced them with new ones Alejandro had given him, better for the smooth floor. Barefoot, he walked to the edge of the stage, close to Valeria in her chair, seated in the front row. "This makes me a little scared," he admitted softly. "I've never been in a place like this alone." "Fear can be a bridge," Alejandro replied. "Tonight we cross it together." Nico nodded. He set his speaker on the floor and chose a soft song he had found one night while searching for rehab exercises. The music filled the theater with a warm vibration. He closed his eyes and began to move. It wasn't the same dance as in the street or the mansion. It was bigger, turns that used the wide space, jumps that left invisible marks in the air. His arms reached out, and the echo of his steps bounced against the walls. For the first time, he wasn't dancing for coins or for strangers. He danced to celebrate life, to honor the girl watching him, and the man who had opened his door. Alejandro sat beside Valeria, holding her hand. He felt her heartbeat in his palm and whispered, "Look how he flies. That's our friend, and you are flying with him." Valeria followed Nico's movements with her eyes. The stage lights reflected on her face. When he jumped, she blinked. When he turned slowly, her index finger moved with the beat. The music carried on, and fear turned into something else. What was once a heavy feeling became a force that pushed them to trust, to enjoy the unknown. Halfway through the song, Nico stepped off the stage. He knelt in front of Valeria and took her hand. "Do you want to come with me?" he asked gently. Alejandro looked at the nurse, who had come for safety. She nodded and helped fasten a special harness around Valeria, attaching her to the chair and to Nico. With care, he guided her onto the stage, keeping the chair secure. The feeling of being on the stage made Valeria's eyes fill with tears. Her blanket moved slightly on her lap. The music played on. Nico placed her in position, making sure she couldn't fall. Then he guided her hands to tap the wooden floor, marking a beat. The sound echoed like a drum. Alejandro, from below, felt his heart match that rhythm. The lights dimmed. The scene looked like something from a storybook. A boy from the street and a girl in a wheelchair, joined by music, with a father learning to surrender to the moment. Nico danced around her, never letting go of the chair. Every step was an invitation for Valeria to feel the stage beneath her. Every turn left a breeze across her face. And then it happened. The chair shook gently with Nico's movements, and Valeria smiled. Not a full smile, just the corners of her lips lifting. Alejandro covered his mouth, holding back a sob. The theater lights shone on his daughter's smile. She had turned fear into a bridge, and crossed it. When the song ended, the silence in the theater felt holy. Nico, breathing hard, knelt down. Valeria lifted her index finger again. It was her way of applauding. Alejandro climbed onto the stage and embraced them both. No words were needed. The night in the empty theater was fuller than any night with an audience. They had turned fear into dance, into a bridge leading to a new chapter. As they left the theater, the moon followed them. Nico carried the speaker. Alejandro pushed the chair, and the nurse closed the door behind them. In the car, Alejandro whispered, "Thank you, both of you. Tonight I saw a different kind of miracle. Not one that makes my daughter walk, but one that makes all of us walk inside." The night of the empty theater stayed in their hearts. The stage had become a refuge of bravery. They had learned that sometimes, to move forward, you must face fear and dance with it, turning it into beats that carry you to the other side. The night at the theater left a deep mark. The next day, the mansion carried an energy that words alone could not explain. The days went on as before. Nico arrived with his speaker. Valeria waited in her chair. Alejandro watched with quiet hope. But something had changed. It wasn't an instant miracle that gave the girl her legs back, but a silent transformation growing from the inside out. During the first session after the theater visit, Nico turned on his speaker and chose a special song. The same one that had played on stage. When Valeria heard the opening notes, she lifted her head. She wasn't only following Nico's steps with her eyes. This time, her head moved slightly with the rhythm. Alejandro held his breath. The nurse leaned closer to watch. And then, as if her body had remembered a forgotten instruction, she tapped the table with her index finger at the same time Nico marked the beat with his foot. It was perfect sync. A shared dance, where both led and followed at once. "She did it at the same time," whispered the nurse, careful not to break the moment. "It's not a miracle," Alejandro answered, tears in his eyes. "It's the result of their work, and the connection they've built." The news of Valeria's progress stayed a secret inside the mansion, but the impact spread. Everyone's attitude began to shift. The gardener noticed that people walked more calmly. The cook found herself humming rhythms while preparing meals. Even the butler, keeper of rules, became a little more flexible with the dance schedule. Nico's steps echoed like hope in every corner. Outside the mansion, the rumors still lingered. People continued to speculate, but more and more voices defended the family's privacy. Public opinion, tired of empty headlines, began to lose interest. The noise faded, while the real story, the one that mattered, kept unfolding inside the house. The family and staff understood they didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They only needed to stay true to their own process. Dr. Herrera visited again. He wanted to see with his own eyes what he'd heard. Nico, Alejandro, and Valeria repeated the exercise. When he saw the synchronized movement of the finger and the foot, the doctor took a moment to reflect. "It's still early to talk about results," he said. "But this kind of response shows the brain is building new connections. It's not a miracle. It's neuroplasticity, something strengthened by repetition and emotional connection." For Alejandro, the word neuroplasticity didn't hit like miracle, but he understood that behind the medical term was a truth. Valeria was reconnecting, recovering something. It was shared movement, more powerful than any headline. In one session, when the music shifted to a faster melody, Valeria lifted her gaze and, for the first time, tapped her finger repeatedly, marking the beat on her own. It was initiative. Nico was surprised, and without a word, he adjusted his steps to follow her rhythm. It was as if the girl had become the teacher. Alejandro was moved to see his daughter leading the choreography. The impact was not what anyone expected. Not a miracle that made her stand, but a shared step that gave everyone a new perspective. Valeria could guide, not only learn. Hope was turning into a reality different from what they had imagined, but just as precious. That afternoon, while having tea in the kitchen, the cook asked shyly, "What if this keeps going? Do you think one day she could lead all of us in a dance?" Nico shrugged, smiling. "She already is," he said. "And she didn't even need to stand up to do it." Alejandro laughed and nodded. "That's true. What amazes me most is that we don't need to call it a miracle. It's simply her, being herself, finding her voice." That night, alone in his room, Alejandro reflected. He thought of all the times he had wished for an instant cure for his daughter. He thought of how Nico's arrival had shaken him, forcing him to look beyond traditional solutions. Now he understood that the real impact wasn't full recovery, but discovering new ways to communicate and connect. They were learning to celebrate small victories, not to waste the beauty of the tiniest gestures, and most of all, to accept that the outside world's expectations didn't match the reality of a life rebuilt step by step. The next day, when Nico arrived, he told Alejandro that a group of street kids had come to him, asking if he could teach them to dance. They had seen the viral video and felt inspired. Nico smiled, but he also worried. "I don't know what to tell them," he admitted. "They want something I'm not sure I can give." Alejandro looked at him and saw himself reflected, but in a mirror that showed a different image. A man learning to listen. "Listen to them," he said. "Maybe, just like you helped us, you can help others. And maybe it's time to share what you've learned here." That thought planted a seed. The connection between Nico and Valeria could grow and reach others. Alejandro, aware of his own responsibility and power, began to imagine creating something bigger. Letting go of his old-world showrooms and building spaces where music and dance could be therapy for more children like Nico and Valeria. The impact Alejandro, Valeria, and Nico had experienced inside the mansion was now echoing beyond its walls. The talk they'd had about other children wanting to learn to dance didn't just fade away. For Alejandro, who had built his life chasing material success, that seed became a call to action. He realized his wealth shouldn't only protect his private world, but also create opportunities for others in situations like Nico's. He thought of the benches Nico had been kicked off, the hospitals full of children without access to alternative therapies, and the helplessness he himself had felt when medicine had failed his daughter. He made a decision that surprised many. He stepped back from several high-profile projects. He canceled the expansion of a luxury boutique chain, postponed the acquisition of a tech company, and sold his collection of vintage cars. The money went into something completely different. An integrative program of dance and music for street children and rehabilitation centers. He named it Rhythms of Life, a name that captured the essence of what he had discovered at home. He called a press conference to make the announcement. People expected another business strategy, but instead they found a different Alejandro. No tie, honest eyes, flanked by Nico and the nurse. Valeria wasn't there in person, but her presence filled every word. "Today I'm giving something up," Alejandro said at the podium. "I'm giving up the belief that wealth is only measured in storefronts and possessions. Today I present Rhythms of Life, a program that will bring music and dance to children like Nico, kids on the streets or in hospitals without access to creative therapies. Dance saved hope in my home. Now I want it to save hope in other places." He explained the plan. Open dance centers in poor neighborhoods where instructors, trained dancers like Nico, would teach rhythm and movement. Build rehabilitation rooms in public hospitals with mirrors, bars, instruments, and adapted equipment. include psychologists, therapists, and volunteers so children could receive emotional as well as physical support, and create scholarships for those with talent who wanted to study dance professionally. The reaction was mixed. Some applauded with emotion, others sneered that it was just an image strategy. But Alejandro wasn't looking for approval. He had learned, by listening to Nico and his daughter, that honest motivations don't need outside validation. At the same conference, Nico took the microphone. "I'm one of those kids," he said. "Music and dance saved me. This program isn't about fame. It's about giving others a place where they won't be kicked out, where they won't be afraid to sleep or to express themselves." His words, simple and direct, echoed louder than any numbers. Soon after the announcement, Alejandro began the work. He met with community groups, contacted foundations already working with street children, and consulted therapists to design the new spaces. He let go of polished showrooms and focused on forgotten places. When he visited a children's hospital, seeing the gray walls and the smell of disinfectant, he imagined the contrast, mirrors and music filling the space, changing the energy of the children inside. The first Rhythms of Life schools opened in small storefronts near the plazas where kids often slept. Nico, along with other young dancers, gave the first classes. At first, children peeked in shyly, hands in their pockets, watching from the doorway. Nico welcomed them with a smile, showed them simple steps, and told his story. Knowing he had once been in their place, the kids lost their fear. They began to copy the moves, laugh at mistakes, and feel their bodies could create something beautiful. In the rehab rooms, nurses saw children in wheelchairs tapping the table or moving their eyes to the beat, just like Valeria. Families, who once saw hospital corridors as the end of hope, now found music-filled spaces that gave them light. Even some doctors, skeptical at first, started to see benefits. Patients slept better, spirits lifted, and in some cases mobility improved. Alejandro became a regular visitor. He no longer spent his days only in boardrooms. He now sat on the floor with children who told him their stories. He listened, learned, and shared. He discovered his presence, without luxury, without distance, was as valuable as his millions. Nico came along too, laughing with the kids, telling them about the mansion and the theater. He showed them that the word miracle didn't always mean something grand. Sometimes a miracle was moving a finger, smiling, or tapping the ground to a song. Over time, the press stopped chasing the miracle headline and began covering the openings of the centers. Reports showed kids like Nico finding in dance a way out of the street. Social media filled with clips of small shows in poor neighborhoods, group therapies in hospitals, and children discovering joy through rhythm. The story of Alejandro, Valeria, and Nico became a symbol of what could happen when someone gives up display windows to embrace humanity. Alejandro knew this program would not cure his daughter, nor instantly bring back every child's laughter. But he understood he was building something lasting, a legacy bigger than his empire. And as he watched Nico teaching under a tree, surrounded by children who followed his steps, Alejandro felt a peace he had never known in his richest business days. He had given up the showrooms, yes, but he had gained something far brighter. Lives moving to the rhythm of hope. Months passed since Rhythms of Life opened its doors, and since Valeria had marked her first conscious beat. The Santori mansion was no longer a place of empty echoes, but a home filled with movement. Afternoons still had Nico and his speaker at the center, but now there were also children arriving from nearby centers to join the sessions. Among them was Mariana, a 10-year-old girl who couldn't move her legs after an accident, and Jose, a 14-year-old who had lived on the streets since he was 7. They came in with frightened eyes and left with shy smiles, learning that rhythm doesn't discriminate. Alejandro had turned the mansion into an open space, not for the curious public, but for those seeking healing. He stepped back from business, delegated responsibilities, and spent his days between meetings with therapists and afternoons inside the program's rooms. He discovered that the title of multimillionaire meant little compared to his role as a father and as the driving force of a project that changed lives. The ambition that once pushed him to buy companies now guided him to build projects with human value. Valeria continued on her path, slow but steady. Her fingers moved with more control. She lifted her gaze when she heard her name. Her breathing followed the music's rhythm. Once, when a group of children visited the mansion, she rang her small bell to mark the beat so everyone could dance together. The children looked at her with admiration, followed her timing, and the room filled with laughter. The girl who had once been immobile in her chair was now leading others without ever standing up. Nico had become a role model. He accompanied Alejandro to open new centers in other cities. He told his story in schools and public squares, and every time he finished, children ran up to hug him and ask him to show them a specific step. He discovered that teaching was as rewarding as dancing. His dream of joining a professional dance group mixed with the joy of seeing others find their rhythm. In time, he formed a dance company made up of former street children and young people with physical disabilities, staging performances that told stories of resilience and dignity. Society, which at first had been dazzled by the boy in the mansion, now spoke of rhythms of life as proof that art and solidarity could transform reality. Festivals were organized in neighborhoods once known only for sirens. Public hospitals adopted dance therapy as a complement to treatment, and schools began including dance in their programs as a form of emotional and physical expression. One evening, Alejandro sat in his garden, watching a group of children practicing outside under Nico's attentive eye. Valeria was beside him, tapping the table softly with her fingers to mark the beat. The breeze moved through the trees like another instrument. He closed his eyes and listened to the combined sound of laughter, music, and footsteps. It was an imperfect symphony, full of uneven voices and broken rhythms, but it was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. He smiled, knowing life would never be the same. He had stopped chasing the noise of the markets and was finally enjoying the heartbeat of his own home. In the closing scene of this story, Nico takes Valeria's hand and lifts it so her fingers tap against the wood. Alejandro, now more a father than a businessman, leans in and taps along with them. The rhythm spreads, reaching everyone around them. The cook, the gardener, the butler, the neighborhood kids, the therapists, the doctors. Though each has a different story, in that moment they share the same beat. The glass walls that once divided their worlds have been replaced by a bridge of steps and music. The future promises no instant miracles, no perfect endings, but it moves forward slowly, full of small victories and the certainty that together, they can keep dancing through any adversity.